minutes. What we propose to do is that we will give 5 minutes each to each speaker. And then, of course, I've put on a timer, and I've been told by the co-host that I have to be very firm in terms of the time, that you don't go beyond. So I'll give you a gentle reminder so that we have more time for interaction. And of course, the speakers will be here and take questions. So we will spend, what, 25, 30 minutes max on this. To save time, I won't introduce the speakers. We have a hugely very eminent group of academicians, practitioners representing think tanks, governments, and their very detailed biodata has been circulated in this book. So I would not repeat that, and straight away go to the main issue, the trade and new technology, and multilateralism and the role of multilateralism and how each one sees it. Let me say, of course, it is commonplace these days to see that there's growing protectionism. Now, is it a new phenomena, or protectionism in some form has always existed, is something that I guess we also need to look at. We in India do believe that while globalization and trade liberalization did happen to a very large extent in manufactured products and goods, maybe in many areas and on many factors of production, there were protectionist tendencies. Of course, each one of us wants rule-based system, but then there is a difference between a rule maker and a rule taker. And of course, have the rules itself tilted the playing field, is something that we would wish to hear about from all of you. Multilateralism, we believe that that is the best form, basically because it is inclusive, it is participative, it gives each one equal voice and sort of space, particularly so in WTO, which has, and rightfully it had been based on a system of consensus building rather than a few deciding for rest. But ultimately, trade also serves a purpose, and that purpose really is whether it leads to welfare of everyone. And I personally believe that the multilateral bodies that deal with trade also have to learn from the main motto of SDG, which is no one left behind. Because the moment you leave behind large segments or geographies, there would be a protectionism in some form or the other. Today, see it from the largest economy, the voices of protectionism, but it will emerge in other corners of the world. So with these words, I leave it, and of course the role of technology and how it is evolving is very, very important, because we have to, and governments have to, balance both technology, protection of technical sort of inventions and innovations, but also balance the need for generation of employment, which is a huge challenge being faced by developing countries. So these are aspects that I would want our speakers to touch upon. And I was given some guide questions, which is there in your paper. And the guide questions really are, there are a set of 4 questions, which I can read it out for all of you. What has been the experience of countries on export-led growth in the manufacturing sector? What has been the contribution of high technology products in trade performance? What is the level of global value chain participation and value addition? And how can trade regimes be designed from global and regional perspectives to allow domestic capacity building? So with these 4 questions, I leave the floor, and we will start with the speaker on my right, Madam Chan.
Thank you very much. I will make the best out of the 5 minutes I have. It's always a delight to be here. I'm going to touch upon a few slides that I prepared. First of all, East Asia's cases of the export-led growth in manufacturing sector in particularly. In the 60s, led by Japan's Flying Geese, and then we have the Four Dragon. In the 80s, we have the newly industrialized economies of Southeast Asian countries. Starting 90s, of course, we are getting into the era of Industry 3.0 and 4.0. So the level of success in the past has been determined mainly, in my observation, in the 4 areas. Number 1, production method, whether we acquire modern technology. In the case of Taiwan, for example, we have original equipment manufacturing and original design manufacturing. For the skill requirement, whether our workers have better job mobility and entrepreneurship, as well as increasing wage income. Third element is the nature of production function. Capital-intensive manufacturing usually create more gap or income inequality. Now, labor-intensive manufacturing, on the other hand, tends to increase employment and income. And then the last element for these determinants will be the external environment, whether there's a fluctuation on the trade and investment economic environment. I'll take a very quick example. This is a study by OECD and followed by a recent update in Brookings Institute. Look at these high-tech products where Hong Hai in Taiwan, Foxconn in China contribute mainly into the iPhone manufacturing. And this map actually tells you that a product of global trade value chain, that you have Japan contribute to 34%, Germany 17%, South Korea 13%, and others, including Taiwan 27%, China 3.6%. So in this particular supply chain, you can see the iPhone alone. This is the figure for 2016, and right now it's increasing a bit. It adds to 17 billion of trade deficit, U.S. trade deficit with China. Even though the vast majority of its input, including semiconductor components that I listed in the chart, came from elsewhere. Now, secondly, I would like to pinpoint about these reference from the World Bank and then OECD studies. Now, let me focus on the challenge of Industry 4.0. This is the era of Internet of Things, smart cities, and so on. Now, the policy agenda to meet these challenges in the manufacturing, according to all these studies, focus on 3 areas, 3 C's, and I add a few elements into these 3 C's explanation. 1, competitiveness, whether we comply with, it's shifting away from the low-wage focus to a broader business environment, including rules of the law and the ecosystem, the use of technology in it. Second point, capability, skill building for workers and firm strengthening. And lastly is the connectivity, whether we enhance the logistic in the whole supply chain, national security issue always restrict whether it's import or export licensing. Now, GVC, the global value chain participation, I will leave this alone since I was given the fact that I only have 1 minute left, so I will focus on the last slides. Now, regarding the design of trade regimes, how do we do that to allow domestic capacity? I focus on 4 points. Number 1, remedies to account for trade imbalance figures. From the trade figures, we focus too much on who is to blame, but forget about the global value chain. The subsidy issues, restrictions on import and export. So it's not only a US-China trade war. It's a trade war against all the supply chain partners. Implementation gap. The current regime always identifies the lack of domestic capacity, and then the intended RTA, therefore, cannot be implemented due to weak rule of law, insufficient infrastructure, especially a combination of these 2. Third element is the domestic capacity, both physical and institutional arrangement. Either require less subsidies, more FDI, and institutional capacity building for preparing for the Industry 4.0. Last item I will focus is IPR issue. all countries cannot escape from being a victim of IPR infringement sooner or later, even though the rules should be tailor-made to reflect domestic capacity, particularly in the light of a balance between developed and developing economies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You went over, while you were more or less within time, 52 seconds is something that I would overlook, but thank you very much. So I won't summarize what you have said. You have been very succinct, and I am sure you will be able to share the slides that you have with the audience if they are interested. May I now call upon, let me go by this, Datuk Seri Jayasiri Jayasena, former Secretary General, Ministry of International Trade and Industry, Malaysia. Your time begins now, sir. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I will make 4 policy-related issues or points, and before that, I would like to preface that by saying that when we talk about technology, we've always been referring to technology in the goods sector, but there's very little focus in the services sector. For instance, technological advances leading to greater utilization of the invincible advances in communication and telecommunications, as well as connectivity, have actually been given very little focus. And this somehow has led to the greater divide between developed countries and developing countries. And this divide can actually affect countries, especially now with the advent of Industry 4.0. Now, first point is on technology transfer. Now, many developing countries lament that foreign direct investors or developed countries hardly provide any technology transfer. But the truth of the matter is, can actually technology transfer take place if we ourselves do not have the enabling environment? And this enabling environment includes things like adequate protection of IPR, a good supply of skill sets for those who are going to implement the technology. So these are things that the countries that are looking for technology must have themselves. Now, of course, collaboration is the best way to get technology transfer. We cannot just impose on FDI by saying that in order to invest here, you must have technology transfer. Now, performance requirements such as this has already been disallowed even in the WTO. No proprietor of technology, especially after spending so much resources, will actually give away technology freely. There must be a price to be paid. So access to technology sometimes is even more important than the whole issue of just technology transfer. Now, second point I'm making is on Industry 4.0. Now, this seems to be the buzzword in many capitals. Now, some governments are concerned, while others think that this will be just another phenomena that will just pass through, just like the first 3 industrial revolutions. Now, the difference now is that in order for companies to be productive and competitive, they cannot just by themselves embrace Industry 4.0. They must ensure that the whole supply chain is Industry 4.0 compliant. And most of those players in the value chain today are SMEs. Now, in our region, more than 90% of enterprises are SMEs. So if we just leave the SMEs to equip themselves and be Industry 4.0 compliant, it is not going to happen. So that's why governments have a role as an enabler. They must intervene to help SMEs ensure that they are Industry 4.0 compliant. And in order for this to happen, they must come out with the enabling environment, provide the legal framework, infrastructure, human resource development, because the workforce of the future has to have a totally different skill sets that people have today. So these are all things that need to be done by the government itself. And to announce, Malaysia just recently rolled out the way forward for Industry 4.0 for the country. And we have covered some of those elements that I have mentioned just now. Now, regional developments. So how are we coping here in the region? I'm referring more to ASEAN. I think it is a cause for concern. Not much political attention is actually given to technology development. Too much focus is being given on liberalization of tariffs, non-tariffs, investment, services. Either bureaucrats are not familiar with the kind of issues that relate to technology development, or they would rather have this be dealt with by the industries themselves. Now, I think the region needs to work together so that collectively there will be a concerted action, especially when ASEAN is trying to make the place a destination for global production and services. Now, my last point is on technology and FTAs. Question was, how could multilateral or international agreements help in the development of technology for some of these countries? Now, if we look at some of the more recent free trade agreements, which are of high standard, wide in scope, there are actually adequate provisions that could allow for collaboration in technology development. Malaysia and Australia, we have bilateral agreements. We have a bilateral agreement with Japan, and we have actually utilized this free trade agreement to develop our parts and components industry in the automotive sector. So it is not correct to say that FTAs are not the avenue to allow for facilitation and technical cooperation, but only trade liberalization. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You also stuck to the time. You went over by 1 minute and 15 seconds. So now we are nearly 2 minutes behind schedule. We'll put it back with the third speaker, hopefully Ambassador Murray McLean.
As Secretary Saran in her keynote address just shortly before mentioned, in recent weeks the world has heard from the APEC meetings in Papua New Guinea echoes of trade-related debate centring on the concepts of nationalism and protectionism on the one hand versus the alternatives of multilateralism and internationalism. To set the scene, allow me to quote the Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison in his speech at APEC. He stated, "Tit-for-tat protectionism and threats of trade wars are in the interests of no one economically, and they undermine the authority of the global and regional trading rules that benefit us all." The well-recognised historian Yuval Noah Harari, in his recently published Lessons for the 21st Century, tackles the concept of globalisation as a counterbalance to the realities of our global ecology, global economy and global science currently stuck with national politics. He is not advocating a global empire or global government, nor is he anti-nation. He strongly promotes awareness of dissonance in our global realities. His ideas are directly relevant to contemporary trade issues. Harari says the conversation should be about climate change, technological disruption, artificial intelligence and bioengineering. These are the big issues. He advocates regulation of artificial intelligence by a strong, cooperative global community. It's critical to observe and accept that with the arrival of Industry 4.0, the world has irrevocably changed, and doing so increasingly faster, as if in a domino cascade, affecting every national economy globally, regionally and locally. The implications of this are the whole human worldview and human relationship to our environment has already changed, a process in which the power of algorithms and biometric data capture in technology applications will only increase. History is a valuable teacher, but cannot from its menu of past practices deliver up any sustainable contemporary and future solutions to new challenges. We have to seek new alternatives. Change at a very fast pace may be the only constant and universal factor. New strategies must be developed. Global, regional and national interests benefit from open-minded, cooperative approach termed internationalism as distinct from nationalism. Greater liberalisation and facilitation of trade practices is implied, together with IP protection, human capital development and the unhampered provision of ITC available universally at low cost. Soundly developed equitable regulatory frameworks and open dialogue are necessary. Each nation's government and policymakers are the key drivers of trade policy. They will look to business to create, innovate and invest in development, but the game changers in the end are governments. National leaders must pursue such arrangements. Nationalism and protectionism is linked to popular domestic support and confidence in economic strength, but is essentially inward-looking and negative in global terms, insofar as there may be short-term gain, but very probably long-term pain. On the other hand, multilateralism and internationalism thrives on and drives global trade dynamics and brings benefits both nationally and globally. It usually demands agreement on multilateral trade regimes, maybe short-term pain, but long-term gain. Very briefly, let me specifically mention trade in new technologies. Trade continues as the key driver of economies, but would be weakened if new protectionist policies were implemented. Key drivers of productivity and trade will emerge from space, defence and biotech, biomed research. Cooperative, they can't be stuck in national quagmires. We have to think beyond that to the global stage to get our own solutions. We need to be able to regulate artificial intelligence globally. That is crucial. There's a lot more I can say, but that's my time. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We actually saved some time. May I move on to Professor Simon Tay, Chairman of Singapore Institute of International Affairs.
Thank you very much.
Professor Tay.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. First, let me start by saying thank you to our two organizers for inviting me. It's always nice to be back in India. Let me secondly set a broad background before we get to the PowerPoint. I think we're meeting at a juncture of very important geopolitical and regional integration shifts. A lot of this is being seen in the Sino-American contestation, which is not merely a trade war, but a much deeper competition involving technology, the subject of our discussion, as well as a broader geopolitical competition. And at stake is, I think, the version of globalization and trade rules-based system we're used to. And the need, pressingly, is for a form of collective leadership involving not only ASEAN, where I'm from, but a wider coalition among many people, including us in Asia. There are opportunities, like RCEP, but there are dangers we will miss these opportunities. I think these possible shifts can also benefit some people, though it will hurt many. And ASEAN, the region I'm from, and South Asia, where we are, could be possible gainers. In technology, they will see another disruption, and let me turn to my slides now. If I could start with the slides, and how does this work? First one? No, second one. Okay. The pattern of development we have seen, I much agree with Mignonne Chan, that this has changed very much. And I'll just speed it up to today. I think really what we're seeing now is a very production chain which hubs around China. So everything you see that the Americans are using against China will have a knock-on effect on many of us. I think that additionally, the AEC, the ASEAN Economic Community, has been trying to integrate ourselves, and all these are Asian-wide responses to what we see as the post-global financial world, crisis world, that we had to learn to get on without America so much. I think the other thing that's coming up very clearly is India's predicted emergence. I mean, India is a force to itself. When I say its emergence, I'm taking the Act East policy seriously. India is a universe to itself, but it's not been fully engaged with the rest of the region, as it will be, I think, quite soon. And so the Sino-American war, it really is creating a lot of options and distractions for us. Let me move on in interest of time to my next slide, and this is about technology. I confess I'm a lawyer, so I'm a bit of a dinosaur when it comes to technology. I think really, for my region, it really sees a great challenge and potential disruption, because we are largely present and future as a middle economy. Projections are ASEAN will grow to be basically middle class and therefore more expensive than now. And so we need to start adopting the kind of technologies that are necessary, or will be left behind in the middle income trap. Transition for value innovation, I think, will be key. And sometimes we can see this happening before our eyes. Indonesia, where Jose Rizal knows much better than I do, has really been an example of this moving, not just in terms of resources and the consumer market, but almost all the unicorns in Southeast Asia are emerging in that large market, which has relatively given space and capital to a lot of startups. The impact of concern, of course, is on jobs. And I'd like to divide that between the AI side, artificial intelligence side, versus what I consider the communications technology side. On the communication technology, I really think that there's a lot to be gained. There are a lot of areas where in Myanmar or in other countries, the mobile technology is just allowing many more companies to start up and do faster, better than ever before. But of course, our region is also facing the social policy that many of you have talked about, of no one left behind. So we will start to see a real need to shift the entire nature of our economies from a very much a resource-based, low value, many jobs based to deal with the changes coming up. I think that requires that we actually redesign our trade agreements. We need to start moving from a trade rules-based approach to one that actually emphasizes the wider integration, that allows wider application of technologies and new ways of thinking and policy making to infrastructure, to smart cities, networks, and other things that really help make the integration real rather than just rules on paper. I mean, I'm not saying the rules on paper are still important, but we need the reality too. And here we need to fill the gaps, allowing service outsourcing, movement of people, and this will be big challenges to rulemakers. And we also need to figure out how to make a regional approach to making better regulation. Let me end there.
You have remained within your 5 minutes, and thank you very much. I guess reflects Singapore's efficiency. Can I now our last and no, we will have a second round after the questions, and so you will have time. I request Professor Laksanapanyakul, consultant, Thailand Development Research Institute, to have the floor.
Thank you.
Time begins now.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Today I will have a quick discussion about trade and new technology issues from Thailand's perspective. I will give a quick overview of our country's development model, and also particularly for the automotive sectors, which is our top priority sector in Thailand. Okay. Is there any PowerPoint? Okay. So this is on the left side. You can see that Thailand is one of the most successful middle-income country, because we, based on the development model of three approach, we heavily rely on the export. Actually, we export 64% of GDP, and we have a very high GVC participation rate. In particularly for automotive sectors, we have a strong supplier base in Thailand. And we also make use of the low wage labor and environment. We can see that domestic value added in Thailand is 42%, but in general, we still have some portion of Thai that are still under poverty line. And most of all, we are industrialized nation, but you can see that we have no adequate internal technology development inside our countries, because if we look at the R&D expenses in Thailand, it accounts for only about 0.3%, which is very, very low compared to many countries in the Asian and in other countries in the world. So we strict on this development model. Our country cannot escape the middle income trap before we are getting old. So we need to develop a new development model which comprise of three approaches. The first one, we have to make a technological catch-up. The second one, we have to better use of connectivity, particularly the trade agreements. And the third one, we have to enhance our labor productivity and environment protection. So this picture will show you the development of our automotive sectors in Thailand. You may see that we have mainly 4 areas of development. The first one is import substitution. The second one is export promotion. The third one is liberalization. And the last one is disruption. You can see that in each era, our countries and other countries in the world face many difficulties. For example, there were Asian financial crisis, subprime crisis, and supply chain disruption. But even with these difficulties, the government of Thailand tried their best to formulate the trade and industrial policies to fit to the changing environment. For example, in the era of liberalization, we have implemented many regional trade agreements with our trading partners. We reduce the FTA rates for many products. For example, in the case of automotive, we protect them as an infant industry, but we gradually reduce the tariff rate. And for the next era, which is coming, which is about the disruption, we can see a rise of protectionism. That means we will find difficulties for exporting our products to many countries, as well as there will be a major disruption change in technology. That means the supplier base in Thailand is mainly based on the internal combustion engine using fuel oils, using oil-based fuel. The next generation of motor vehicle will be the much more energy friendly, which is maybe electrical or fuel cell, something like that. So this will have major impact on our industry development. So the government should think much about this. So what should we do? We propose that apart from the protectionist policies in other countries, which are out of our country's control, the only things we can do is to strictly with our new development models, which have 3 approaches that I mentioned. For example, for technological catch-up, we need to reduce the tariff for major raw materials that we cannot produce now. For example, the battery, motor, lightweight components, something like that. And we need to liberalize our service and facilitate more for investment. We should promote R&D and I activities through grants, tax, and non-tax incentive. Okay. So if I have time, I will come back later for the other issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A big hand to all the speakers for very sharp and focused presentations, which I'm sure will raise many questions. Of course, for the questioners also, there are ground rules that it has to be questions. Otherwise, both us and the panelists would spend a lot of time trying to cull out the question from your interventions. To do, just introduce yourself and also identify the panelists you would want your question to be answered. I have one hand there, gentlemen. So what we'll do is we'll take 3 or 4 questions. We have 20 minutes more. So
I'm an economist. 2 questions, if I could be permitted that, Mr. Chair. First, I think we should all remember that we're meeting in what is the poorest country, and this is the point made by the ambassador in the keynote as well, of the group represented here. So my first question is, since many of you are more integrated with China than India is so far, do you have guidance on how India should, as it were, prepare itself, being much poorer than China, in integrating with China? Or is the attitude of our media, which is, and our negotiators as far as I know, or for all I know, that basically it is dangerous for India to integrate with a richer China? And secondly, since this is about technology, the question of what are benchmarks that poor countries should use to decide where they are in technology and where they should be, I think is quite important. The make versus buy decision. Our telecom industry, I think, flourished because we innovated on business models rather than basic research. China at the moment is putting a lot of resources into basic research, and I think I heard in the presentation from Thailand that they lament the fact that there's not a lot of innovation taking place. So for this group of countries, for the ASEAN countries, for India, what is the right metric for technology?
Thank you, Chairman. Ashok Sarjanha, former ambassador. I have two short questions. One to Datuk Jayasiri, Jayasena. And both of my questions are really related to what has been mentioned as the trade war between United States and China. There are, some of the allegations and some of the complaints that have been made by the United States against China. Currency manipulation, etc., it's an old one. But, you mentioned one that is forcing the companies to share the technologies with the promise to get a share of the market access, that is not allowed by the WTO. Some of the other allegations are in terms of the fact that there is inadequate protection of intellectual property rights. My question to you is, are any of these things, can they be taken up in the WTO with the safe that there will be a solution that the WTO can bring to these questions if the United States had decided to go to the WTO rather than taking these unilateral measures which it says are affecting its national security. So that's the question to you. My second question is to Professor Simon Tay. And you, Professor Tay, mentioned, and I think that was also brought out by Dr. Chan, that let's say the example of iPhone that you gave, that about 3% plus of the value addition is being done in China, while rest is being done as a result of the global value chains for things that are happening elsewhere. So if there is this additional tariffs that are being imposed on imports from China, it is hurting the other countries also, as you mentioned. And now there are reports that industries are moving out of China. My question to you is, can this be done in a quick manner, this movement of the industry from China outside? And if that happens, will that not help all the countries in the region? Because even that 3% or 5%, whatever it is, in these high technology value products, that will also come to the other countries, and it will be beneficial because the global value chains are already existing in these markets. Thank you.
Any more questions? Yeah, Professor.
Thank you, Chair. My greetings to all the speakers for excellent presentations. My question goes to Professor Simon Tay for your excellent presentation this afternoon. Your point about flying geese, I wanted to ask you what direction geese are really going in and how you see Akamatsu's theoretical framework, even if we keep Prebisk-Singer hypothesis aside, how you see what direction they are going. Are they coming back home as Trump is emphasizing, or they are likely to go the Asia, Africa, largely in context of, as in the keynote address it was mentioned, free, open, inclusive, prosperous Indo-Pacific?
Please.
Thank you very much. Shu Urata from Japan. I have a question maybe to all the panelists. This is a question related to Dr. Sumanberry asked earlier. Technology, and my case, technology and employment. Many technologies now developed are skill biased, so-called technology, or unskilled labor-saving technology. Typical cases, robot or robotics. In order to produce, competitive goods, maybe it is necessary to use this technology. If that is the case, how should developing countries, which is, almost by definition, with abundant labor, deal with this technology? If they apply or adopt this technology, I think that will result in maybe possible unemployment problem. That, of course, is a problem. So I just wanted to ask panelists how developing countries should deal with these technological development. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have nearly 6 questions. Which order and who would like to take which question? Professor Tay, there was one specifically directed to you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Let me start with the question. I think I'll take it together. The question of India integration, value chains across Asia, and the flying geese, if I could try to group them together. Because I think India-China relations are something that no one should talk about as maybe India and China. It's a very difficult topic. There's so many dimensions about it. But I think I'll put the question back to you in India. It's not so much integrating with China. Given what I've said about how China is integrated, or we are integrated around China, it's a question of whether you want to be integrated with the rest of East Asia. It's not that you can integrate with everybody else and leave China out of it. So of course, the terms of engagement, there have been complaints not only by Trump, but by Europeans and others about Chinese policies. And each country must deal with this as you can. I would say that every country always tries to negotiate the best for them and to get away with hell if they can get away with hell. So, it's up to you, and you're a big country, so you can find a good balancing point. The broader question about the value chains, I think there are signs that this is not a trade war, but a long-term, much deeper competition. If that is correct, and it's not just Trump, but it's a broad spectrum of the American establishment, American companies, then some of us see a 7 to 10 year ongoing conflict. I mean, it can come up and down. At G20, maybe Trump will say something nice, it'll come down a bit, but overall, this competition is likely to continue. Therefore, the value chains are likely to move. Even before this, many companies were already looking for a China plus one strategy. And Vietnam, which Tan knows very well, is the first beneficiary of this, really boomed. Vietnam, of course, has its own reasons to be attractive. ASEAN has its own reasons to be attractive. But this pressure on the China supply chain will help. China has also been very successful keeping not only the high end, not only the middle, but even the low value jobs. I don't know how they did this. But with this final push, some of these lower value added jobs may start to go into Cambodia, Laos, and other places where labor is still very cheap. And I think this brings me to the question of some of the more difficult clusters. Many people want to move into ASEAN or other countries, but can those countries catch it? Now, Thailand's got some strong clusters, autos and some electronics, but Penang in Malaysia got some strong clusters. But they really do need the cluster to attach to. Otherwise, there's really no place for them to go, even though China is not so cheap or as comfortable or whatever it is, they have no choice. So I think you will see a lot of companies now trying to figure out what to do if this is going to be a much more divided world, where China, they'll never give up on China, but there will be much less ability to just rely only on China. And I think I've said too much, so I'll stop there.
Anybody else would like to? I think Ambassador Ashok had a specific question to me on the WTO. I agree with you that the rules in the WTO will not be actually allowing this kind of solutions. But the point I think people are lamenting about is that while the system is there, the members of the system have sort of abused the system. They should have gone through the process and let the body, the DSB, to decide what should be the recourse before unilaterally starting to impose the tariff hikes. I think that is the one that people are complaining about. While there's always room for looking at some of these issues if they do not actually allow for good trade relations in the future. Now, even some of the FTAs, I think, have actually tried to address some of these issues. Now, on, I think the first question about being integrated with China. Well, for Malaysia, I would say that there is some history to it. I think we were one of the earliest to establish relations with China, and then we also have a Chinese community in Malaysia. And we also see China as a huge market. And that's one of the reasons why we established very close relations. Now, when we were negotiating the TPP, people were asking, are you forsaking China for the US? We said no, there is no competition between the TPP and the Chinese market. I think, Professor Urata, you asked about labor saving and technology development. In Malaysia's case, it is different. We used to have cheap labor and so on. But today, we are actually grappling with foreign workers. And we want technology development, automation, in order to be able to cut down the flow of low-paid foreign workers, because that's one big issue that we are grappling with to get out of the middle-income trap.
Okay. Let me address Professor Urata's comment. In the case of Thailand, we are facing the many difficulties. In particularly, we're facing aging economy, and we're facing a shortage of labor, both in terms of quantity and quality. So in the case of Thailand, we are not much worried about the arise of the new technology to replace the labor, because we have some problems already. But we have to prepare ourselves for making our labor to be highly qualified for the new technology, because they have to be the controller, and I mean they have to work with the robot, something like that. So they have to understand and can design them correspondingly. So for other countries, I think there are some grace period between before the technology can have major impacts on their countries. In this grace period, these countries, as well as Thailand, should improve our education system. So the next generation of our labor will be better quality. Thank you.
A few humble views. Story is an inspirational one. Japan used to produce no cars, but they become a car manufacturing kingdom, because first of all, they have very well-trained students go abroad and then coming back to Japan. They don't stay out of the country. They come back to Japan. And Japan bought all the first-rate cars where there is, from Germany, from British, from UK, from the US. And the return engineering, they do reverse engineering and will be made out of it. So buy or make, it depends on various stages of domestic capacity. I would like to mention about MAI, Multilateral Agreement on Investment. A lot of discussion has been going on, and then the most difficult part is that how do you maintain a multilateral system with domestic sovereignty in terms of which investors they want to invite. So in terms of process technology or technology per se, it's not that China demand IPR or review to them. Otherwise, they could make 100% iPhone themselves. So the regulation is still there as such that it's a global value chain itself, each with its own comparative advantage. Where would the flying geese go? I think it would depend on nations. Which nation in a given time produce the most inviting business environment, and then that's where the trend will go. For India, India's advantage, I think, is on the software in the whole IT industry. So given the stage of hardware manufacturing is not still the cup of tea as yet, at this stage, I think India could do very well by combining the software with a hardware country. Whether this country is A or B, it will be for India to decide. Now, the last one, I would touch upon a little bit about the national security. National security is the area, I believe, that in multilateral system is very difficult to define because each country in a given time feel more secure or less secure in a certain protective area. So I would like to say that this is still the challenge for a regional global regime to, so collaborate with each other. How do we define security? Thank you.
May I just make a couple of comments? One is about the first question about how should India integrate with China or not or whatever. First of all, I think every country that has its own trade policy inevitably must consider first and foremost its own national interests before it proceeds to down a particular path. Having spent quite a lot of time in China over the last 40 years serving as a diplomat, one abiding impression I have is that China does nothing, literally nothing, without very clearly defining what its interests in such a policy, action or activity are. It is very clearly focused on what is in China's interests first and foremost. Now, as far as India is concerned, India obviously has its own special situation, just like every other nation is. So it's really up to India to make that decision, I think, rather than to have a prescription or a template to follow particularly. But I think the key point really is also, rather than just talking about the somewhat limited subject of integration with China, is the point that Simon Tay also just made now, and that is that China is, of course, a huge economy and a growth centre in the world and driving a lot of economic change and development in this region. But it is only one country in this region, and it is part of a global community that is well beyond the Indo-Pacific region. It goes well beyond, of course, with the United States in particular, but also with Europe and elsewhere. So I think it's very important, as I tried to make the point in my remarks, is to think of global solutions rather than bilateral solutions or nationalistic solutions to trade regulation. And the other point I wanted to make really is that we are all in this room all conscious of Industry 4.0, artificial intelligence, smart cities, and all of those things, but a lot of it is just happening so fast that there is no framework to manage it in an appropriate way, and we really need to pay attention to that because it is really being taken away from, by the fast pace of global development, it's being taken away from our own national borders to a global issue.
Thank you. Let me use my prerogative as chair, because I noticed that the entire discussion here is, again, as I said right in the beginning, that liberalization has focused on manufactured products. Now, if we really want everybody to grow, should we not also look at the rules that have governed one sector where the largest number of people around the world are involved, which is agriculture? And their produce, does it have the same ease of access around the world as manufactured? And that's a question that we'll have to ask. If we look at new design of a multilateral trading system, yeah, I think if anybody would like to answer that, do you think agriculture should be a focus in the new, in a sense, can we make it reach the same level of liberalization as manufactured products?
I've got no agriculture, so maybe I'll just start. Well, no, I'm joking, but I think that the little I know about agriculture suggests that we are really have a very divided economy, right? We have the really basic smallholders and political vote holders. So really that creates a constituency which is very hard to open up. On the other hand, you see really agribusinesses. And I think that is where, in many areas, we see developing countries being stymied from exports to market access because of environmental or sanitary and phytosanitary rules. Some are real, some are not. So I think that we are, particularly ASEAN, at the cusp of trying to focus on that second lot, the agribusinesses, and trying to move up the value chain so that we treat it more like a processed and industrial product and get higher value added rather than the truly low end. But that creates the tension within the social policies at home, right? Because on top of, while there are some large agribusinesses, often their supply chain has a million smallholders like palm oil. You know what I mean? Really, so then you see this tension both nationally and in regional trade. So I think that in that sense, the agribusinesses are an area where there's a lot of growth, potentially. But because of the competitive issues with the other producers in the West, you will see a lot of pushback. The thing I think that I'm more keen on is services, actually. I know this is a very strong point for India. I think that services are an essential part of manufacturing and products now. And without that, we can't really progress much further. Yeah, you look at most FTAs, they tend to leave services out of it completely. So it's something that we really got to think very hard about, and there's a lot of value to capture there.
Thank you. We can just at best have 1 more minute. So 1 more question, anyone?
Let me try to address your comment.
Yes, and you could perhaps also answer, because I heard the comment that you all see China as a big market, and so does it is a big market. We also see it as a big market. But the countries which are much more integrated with China than India, do they see it as a market that is open for finished products or only for raw materials and intermediates? And I would like to hear your comments from your experiences.
Actually, let me address your question about the agricultural liberalization. In the case of Thailand, as Professor Simon said, that we have many smallholders, farmers in our countries, and the government try to do a lot to help them to upgrade them to be a smart farmer, something like that. But you can see that many government fails to do so. So I'm not sure whether it will be promising for upgrading our farmers, but I can see the trend in Thailand that the big business change their business model. They try to incorporate smallholders into their business plan to some kind of contract farming, something like that. They can transfer the technology, and of course they get the profit from doing that, but this way they try to be more friendly to smallholders to upgrade themselves, something like that. So if this trend coming in the future, I think that the agricultural sector in our countries and in other countries may be more ready to open up themselves. Yeah.
Please.
Sorry, Vietnam #1 trading partner with among ASEAN countries. Vietnam #1. And China is also our #1 trading partner, right? So for every more than $4, our trade $1 with China. So if we look at the structure of our trade with China, so we suffer huge deficit with China. But #1 among the deficit, there's intermediate goods. So that's about the investment and production network, right? And also participation of the Vietnam SME in the GBC production network. And number two, in the deficit between Vietnam and China at the equipment, capital goods, right? So that's about ODA, investment, or many other things. But if we look at the finance, consumption goods, we are more or less, balanced between two countries. And even over the last 3 years, export from Vietnam increased in that sense much faster than from China, right? Particularly agriculture product and some manufacturing finance product. So I think, thinking about China, there's a finance market for the finance goods, and China now under restructuring, but also thinking about the investment production network and competitiveness of the SMEs.
Thank you very much for sharing your Vietnam experience. Obviously, it's a good experience. Unfortunately, in India, we have a slightly different view of things, where we have been trying to access the Chinese market as lucrative as it is, but without too much of success. Maybe we have to try harder. I think with these words, we should close this session. We are just 5 minutes over time. Thank you very much, all of you. And of course, the bottom line really is that, and this I'm borrowing from a professor that we heard yesterday, that the new rules-based economy and globalization will have to move away from this quarterly reporting to shareholders in terms of the profits that the corporations make, to something called social enterprise, which not only creates profits, but also creates values and blended values. And that is a huge philosophical shift that corporations will have to do, so that everybody around the world has a buy-in and becomes a stakeholder in the process of globalization. Because no matter what system we create, unless the human beings are at the center and the welfare is the primary concern, there would be, unfortunately, voices of protectionism from around the world. So with these words, I thank all of you, and let us give them a big hand. Sorry, administrative announcement. I think we are breaking for lunch and coffee break. Okay, lunch. Sorry, I thought we started early morning. We started post-lunch. I think maybe I was feeling hungry. So after the coffee break, we reassemble here at 3:10. Thank you.